Hi, good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Jeannie Scatson, Senior Planner. It's really nice to be in front of you in my first council presentation, so thank you. Tonight, we'll be talking about STEP housing, which is kind of an acronym for some housing types that we're required to be planning for. And those STEP kind of, if you move the letters around, stands for emergency shelters, transitional housing, emergency housing, and permanent supportive housing. Next, oh, do I control the slides? Yep. Oh, there goes a lot. Actually, oh, okay. Great. Okay, so STEP housing. These four housing types help provide a kind of a continuum of housing options designed specifically for those that are experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness. I think before we dive into what differentiates each of these housing types between each other or themselves, I want to provide a little more context. So, like I said, we're here to talk about STEP tonight, but which plays a really crucial role in addressing homelessness in our city. Burien, like many cities across the region and the nation, face a significant challenge with rising homelessness. While it's difficult to pinpoint the exact number of individuals experiencing homelessness, but based on local outreach, we estimate that around 100 individuals are unhoused every day or every night in Burien. Many of these people rely on resources like severe weather shelters, which often reach capacity every year. From conversations with the Highline School District, there are currently over 1,400 students in the district that qualify for the McKinney-Vento program. The McKinney-Vento program means that means there's 1,400 children or unaccompanied youth that are lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, and it has been increasing over time. These numbers align with the broader trends found in King County, where the King County Regional Homelessness Authority recently reported that an estimated 16,385 people experience homelessness on any given night, marking a 23% increase since 2022. The primary drivers of homelessness include rising rents, stagnant incomes, and a critical shortage of affordable housing. In response, the city is working to ensure that our development regulations align with state requirements through House Bill 1220, as well as meet our housing needs to meet the most vulnerable populations by the end of the year, and also ensure that these regulations are both effective and responsive to the needs of those served. Okay, so now back to the four types. I'm going to begin this continuum, these four housing types with the most immediate need and the lowest barrier. That would be emergency shelters. Emergency shelters are different than the other three housing types because they might not even provide overnight accommodations. An emergency shelter can also be a day center, a place where someone who is chronically or experiencing homelessness can wash their clothes, take a shower, get some of the basic needs addressed. It can also include an overnight place to sleep, but that's different than the other housing types where they are housing types. The emergency housing, transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing all provide overnight accommodations, a place to sleep at night. But they differ in terms of how long you might stay, or whether you go into a lease or have a occupancy requirement, whether you're have a case management team, or how long, like I said, how long you have to stay. So emergency housing is kind of the next ledge in terms of from immediate need to a more stable long-term solution. So emergency housing may serve families and individuals experiencing homelessness, but something unique is it might also be those who are at imminent risk of becoming homeless. So that's a kind of a difference as well. Transitional housing is very similar to housing you might see like apartments, or condos or single family homes that are often owned or operated by nonprofit organizations that typically have a duration for 2 years. Transitional housing was created as a kind of a stopgap to help really build some foundation and stability to then find a a long-term solution for housing. Although some of these buckets in terms of emergency housing, those who are living in emergency housing, we're hearing from service providers are staying much longer than they used to. They're out because there's not enough housing available upstream. So even those that are staying in transitional housing that are typically or less than 2 years, maybe are staying longer than 2 years. And then last of the four housing types is permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is a dwelling unit. So each of these units will have all of the provisions needed: a bathroom, a kitchen, a place to sleep. And that's different than a permanent supportive house, or I'm sorry, than the other three types that may be more of a dormitory style or may operate differently. Permanent supportive housing also would require the resident to be in a lease. So in terms of how these different housing types operate, you might expect an emergency shelter to have a different clientele every night. It could be a different clientele every night, but it also could be some of the same people coming back. Whereas emergency housing is a little more stable in terms of who's staying there. And then transitional housing, we're looking at 2 years, maybe the same resident. You might not even know that they're in a transitional arrangement. And then there's permanent supportive housing, which is a long-term permanent solution intended to be I guess, the long-term solution. Great. I'm going to go through a couple examples of step housing that currently exists in the region and in Burien specifically. So a good example of emergency shelters would be what's provided through the Highline United Methodist Church, which began as a severe weather shelter. So basically open and in response to severe weather, but maybe different residents every night, and is designed to meet the immediate need of those experiencing homelessness. An example of emergency housing might be Mary's Place, where residents are staying longer than 30 days and are often families and are paired with a lot of other resources. Another example for transitional housing, I'm pulling from my experience at Federal Way. I was a planner there before I came here. And Fusion is an organization that owns and operates 26 transitional housing units. Some of them are condos, and this example on the slide is actually a single family house that that was like burnt down kind of and demolished and being replaced with a duplex. And those units will be used for transitional housing of families. This is also an opportunity to kind of show, a different picture of what housing may look like that meet this term or this defined term as permanent supportive housing or transitional housing, but it may look really different depending on its context or where it's located. And lastly, what's you may be really familiar with is Bloomside. Bloomside provides 95 units of permanent supportive housing here in Burien. What is equally important to discussing what is step housing and going through those examples is also talking about what is not step housing, to not confuse and conflate with what we're regulating. The intention of this ordinance will be in terms of amending the Burien Municipal Code to define these terms and then to adjust where they're allowed and integrate them into the development standards and regulations. But here on the slide is just a list of other, some facilities, some residential units that are defined in our development regulations and have provided unique or specific service, and but not to be confused with step housing. I appreciated Council Members Akey's comment earlier about the comp plan. All right, we're planning about all these numbers, but it doesn't mean we have to build them. And she's right on, she's correct there. That's a perfect mindset to apply here. I haven't shown you the graphs yet, but that's coming soon, of how many housing units we need to be planning for, specifically those that are serving those that are experiencing homelessness through emergency housing beds and permanent supportive housing units. But it's I think a really good item to kind of point on is that what we're using the comprehensive plan to kind of set the foundation in terms of capacity, making sure we're planning for enough housing units and enough jobs, but then also making sure that those units that can be built serve the all income bands. And another piece is that we comply with the deadline. So another piece of this work and why we're wanting to get it adopted by December 2020, December 31st of this year is when this bill was passed a couple years ago, we had until September of that year to comply. And since we haven't, we are now required to adopt regulations by the time of our deadline for the comprehensive plan, which is the end of this year. So we'll be doing that. Side note, a benefit to Burien being a little late to the game in terms of adopting these development regulations and changes is now we have a lot of guidance to rely on from the Department of Commerce, whether it's best practices or what's legal and what's recommended, and just a lot of resources that help guide the preparation of these materials and the communications with the public. So here's the 2044 target. In Liz and Lisa's presentation earlier about the Burien 2024 comp plan, we heard the larger numbers. This chart here breaks out our housing need of 7,500 units by 2044 by income band. And the two bars on the far left are, there's a box around them, and those are the two that we're talking about. There's 759 units of permanent supportive housing we're planning for, and that 759 units are part of the 7,500. Whereas the 1,433 emergency housing beds that are needed by 2044 are not included in the 7,500 total permanent units. I think this was a great conversation or a topic brought up at Planning Commission. Well, what about our progress to tracking it? So this is another look more specifically just at those two far left bars is the emergency housing need and the PSH looking today. So when these numbers were allocated through the King County countywide planning policies, the city ratified through this process of ratification, we got these housing units in need. But that number was based on 2019 data. And we now have grown. So you'll see the Bloomside project, those 95 units that were built and now operating in the city go towards satisfying that 759 target by 2044. So if you look closely, it's not super legible. Now we have a running total of only 664 permanent supportive housing units. Basically, just trying to reflect the fact that as these units are built, we can track them and they're being included. So another big piece of House Bill 1220 is the direction or the obligation for the city to allow for permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in all zones that allow for residential and hotels in the city, and to allow for emergency shelters and emergency housing to be permitted in all zones that allow for hotels. So this map here is an oversimplified zoning map that reflects the blue being the areas where all step housing types are needed to be permitted, and the kind of gradient of red and orange are residential zones that don't currently and we are proposing to allow for hotels. And those are where just permanent supportive housing and transitional housing would be permitted or would be required to be permitted. So we've been, on this started this process in July, but have began with looking at an overview and analysis of the state statutes, not only 1220, but other things that apply in conjunction with this, as well as, diving deep into the countywide planning policies and the numbers. And through September and October, we've done some outreach and have begun drafting the development regulations. I would like to highlight an activity. We hosted a panel discussion at Planning Commission with service providers of step housing types so that the Planning Commission could be as informed as possible before making a recommendation and hear firsthand what the experiences are for and how regulations might impact the operations and siting of step housing types from the providers. So we did that on September 25th, and I think it was a hit. And I hope that it will inform their recommendation to council. And, between now and November, we'll review the recommendation and hope to have a adopted ordinance by October 9th. There are some topics that, so far in this presentation, we've gone over what we need to do. We need to be planning for this number of units. The bill says we have to allow these housing types in these zones. Well, that doesn't mean that there's no discretion for the city to mold or shape what this looks like locally. Some local areas or areas of discretion that have come up and of interest to the Planning Commission include requiring a registration requirement for all step housing types to operate in the city. They need to register, and that's a way for the city to have on file and for the public to learn about the operators and contact information and operating procedures. Also providing public noticing and community meetings. This is modeled a little bit after the Affordable Housing Demonstration Project or Program that requires 2 community meetings, as well as considering a potential horizontal separation, so creating a buffer from and size limitations on emergency shelters, as well as deciphering the appropriate permit review process for emergency shelters and emergency housing over a certain size. So those, you can expect maybe some specific regulations to those areas of interest when we come back with draft ordinance. But we're going to come back again and I'll update you along the way before a draft code language comes. The key takeaways from this presentation is that step housing is an important component to addressing the gap in housing options, and it's designed to meet those to meet the needs of those at risk or experiencing homelessness. And that Burien must adopt these amendments to the Burien Municipal Code to comply with the deadline by December 31st, 2024. And I don't want this last comment to be an afterthought, but I did want to say it earlier, but I think it was appropriate to hear the planned action ordinance conversation in the comp plan 2024 or 2044 conversation earlier, to keep in mind that the city is not just planning for housing that's geared to meet the needs of those experiencing homelessness. This ordinance will, it'll be specific to that, but the city has done a lot and is doing a lot actively that will meet both the need of developers for market rate and income restricted housing through the efforts of the multifamily tax exemption, the planned action. There's a lot of benefits. So while this project or this process itself is in response to housing, very specific to low income and those experiencing homelessness, it's not a one size fit all. There's a lot of other actions the city planning division is taking to further address housing need across the entire spectrum, including market rate.
Cheney, I might just add that we will be at the Planning Commission this Wednesday evening, and we have provided in their packet some draft regulations for them to begin to consider. So it's all becoming very real very quickly. And then we will be coming back and we are looking to adopt by the December 9th public council meeting would be our date for adoption.
Which, can you repeat that date? December 9th?
December 9th.
December 9th.
Yeah. And so we're available for any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that in-depth presentation. And I know that many on council, including myself, have met with you both separately to discuss this in depth. I think it's an important reminder that this is required by state law, but also that we've learned a lot from other cities that have done it beforehand, and best practices by Commerce for sure. Are there any questions? Councilmember Reiki.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and just being aware that this is a requirement and we're going to do at least the minimum of the requirement. And this doesn't mean that tomorrow we're going to be building a whole bunch of step housing. So just want to make sure the public understands. And I did have a question about the process. Is there a public hearing that's required, like the ones that we were running today? Will that be also a part of this process?
Yes, there will be a public hearing. We'll be holding that through the Planning Commission, and that will happen, what date? do we
October
have?
23rd.
October 23rd of that public hearing.
Thank you.
Do we have a list or a worksheet of what we have already in Burien for step housing? Like for instance, obviously shelters, you only have them during winter. And then just a transitional, I mean, you see Mary's place, but I know we have other places as well.
Yeah, we have an inventory of the step housing types, and that includes items that were not presented tonight. So there's the hospitality house that provides 9 units of emergency housing that kind of also operates like transitional housing, as well as some Navos properties in the community. But yeah, there is an inventory.
I'd like to see if I can get a copy of that inventory, and I would just want to say this for the public. I mean, I think that, housing, I mean, that's just called the elephant in the room. We've had a major conversation, legal battles over what does it look to house individuals in the city. And I'm of the mindset that at some point, at some time, maybe we can work together to figure out what we're gonna do with individuals that suffer from severe drug addiction, severe mental health, because I think when we talk about housing and we talk about people that aren't sheltered, we kind of try to do one shoe fits all. And fact of the matter is, just read an article that uh, the fastest growing population that's going homeless is really our baby boomers, not being able to have enough money to retire in dignity because of lack of pension or healthcare funds. I think that recently, until after the 1980s, did we start seeing the bigger raises that we see. And for people that work in the tech economy, obviously they're going to be able to have their retirement and they're going to be taken care of. But, I think as we move as a city and as a region, we're a tech economy, and economy makes things very expensive. And so for me, I think it's worth the conversation. As painful as it is, of looking at what we're going to do as far as shelters. And we've identified where they may end up going, obviously because of state law. But as we move forward, I do believe that, the conversations still need to be had with, the hospital. I know the hospital has some property, um, and we are a healthcare community. And so for me, it's like looking at where does it make sense that maybe we have, inpatient care somewhere, on hospital property? What does that look like? What kind of counseling does these places need to be? Look, I supported, the shelter that we have here today, and there was a lot of public pressure not to support it. The DESC facility. But again, I've continued to talk to residents, and I got to say, look, there is challenges when you have facilities that have a facility like that. And I've just talked to some neighbors, and I would say in this message at DSC, because I've asked that when you come to the city, you got to be a good neighbor. Well, what does that mean? Having conversations with the businesses, making sure that we either have more security on the properties, being able to make sure that we're dealing with the situation in an appropriate way. Now, I think that for me, as we move forward with STEP and figure out what the state mandate is, I don't think we're the only city that's going to struggle with this. I think there's going to be other cities struggling with it, but I got to say that we have been leaders. I think we have facilities that we've built. I know Mary's Place was a place nobody wanted when I was the mayor of the city. And, they've been good neighbors. They've been able to help families stay out of shelter. Stay off the streets and have shelter. And so as we move forward in this conversation, I mean, I think that it's, I'm willing to have those conversations. Well, I know that right now it's in the commissioner's hands and figuring out what does it look like. But I just wanted to say that these continue to be hard conversations, and I don't think we should shy away from them. I think as a city, if we can come together and figure out, okay, what does that look like? What can we do to make sure that we have the tools, the resources to be able to figure this out as a region and more importantly as a city. So that's all I have to say on this particular subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other Councilmember Moore?
I agree with Councilmember Mata's request that I would be curious of what the inventory of existing units are without drawing attention to those units necessarily, because I think the ones we're less aware of are ones that maybe are not creating public conversation, and maybe that's appropriate for those units. But I think it's important for people to recognize how many different kinds of step housing there are. And I really liked your slide where you showed a few of them, just to show different sizes and different neighborhoods and locations. I think that's a message that, when we talk about the number of units, it's not going to be 4 huge buildings with all the step housing in one in each. It's going to be much more distributed than that.
Thank you. We'll be sure to provide some information, and I appreciate your consideration of confidentiality as well. That's often a real concern for people that are living in different housing models.
Councilmember Garcia.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for the presentation. It's really good information. Appreciate the thoughtful comments from my colleagues on, more than anything, letting our residents know this does not mean that everything that we are planning for will be built, and it won't be built tomorrow. This is just long-term planning. Having said that, one of the things that I wanted to get information on is, as we look to have plans for the STEP type of housing, I've seen the challenges is the actual time it takes to build it and the cost. And knowing that we have somebody here from the Master Builders Association, it may be helpful to know future is who funds these? How are these funded? How long does it take to fund some of these projects? Because I think that will help the public realize that, yes, if we as we get to designate an area, how long and how hard I mean, I know it takes a long time. I know that it's mostly nonprofit, but the general public does not. And I think it would be helpful for us to know that information so that our public is aware of that as well, because these things are probably some of the hardest development projects, housing projects to build, the most challenging because of the cost and time. So that's all.
Thank you. We'll definitely bring back some more information. Cheney may have some initial thoughts. But I just want to kind of say that is the hard part, is getting it built. It's so hard to get the funding together because generally you're getting funding from, 10 different sources and everybody has their own requirements. And so trying to, marry that up is very, very challenging. One of the things that we heard very clearly when we did the panel discussion at Planning Commission was that not only do they have the funding challenges, they also often have permitting challenges. And that is something that we are trying to kind of thread the needle with the Planning Commission of providing that communication to the public and the feedback and opportunities for engagement, but at the same time, not creating policies that are so onerous, it ends up making the process add another year or something to the permitting process. So that is part of the balancing act. It's the permitting process, but it also just is funding in general. Cheney, did you have any answers?
I was just gonna add, like, of which a lot of this is within our control. So there are things that will directly impact the timing and the cost of step housing and how we choose to regulate it.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you all very much.